Today on Prophecy Focus, we will examine the long-term conflict between the Jewish people and the Palestinians and why this actually is taking place. I'm Dr. Richard Schmidt, founder of Prophecy Focus Ministries and pastor at Union Grove Baptist Church in Union Grove, Wisconsin. Well, I'm thrilled to death again. I have Dr. Jimmy DeYoung, my good friend and colleague here, and a prophecy expert, and we're going to be looking at this long-term conflict. Well, welcome, Doc. It's good to see you again.
It's good to be with you, Dr. Schmidt. I love being on the set with you and discussing Bible prophecy.
It's our passion. It's one of the things that we're just thrilled to death to do. Well, as we like to say right here on Prophecy Focus, we love to peel God's prophetic word one passage at a time. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. But this is a very, very interesting, and it's an issue that all of us in our generation, we've been going through. We're constantly seeing these conflicts back and forth between the Palestinians. Sometimes we'll call them Arabs, folks that even we'll call them in the Muslim communities and so forth. And there's all this constant conflict. So, Doc, you're an expert on this area. We're going to very quickly do what is taking place today. What are some of the things in the recent generations, the conflicts that most of our folks that are watching today, they're familiar with. And then I'm going to ask you to go deep into God's Word, pull out the issues that have led to the past, the present, the prophetic scenarios of this long-term conflict. So maybe, and I know you know this, we're very, very quickly, let's just go through some of the recent things since 1948, when Israel once again became, if you will, a state or a country. Tell us just very briefly about the War of Independence, what happened there.
Oh, yes. Well, as the Jews were returning to the land, they were given this area. As a matter of fact, the United Nations wanted to give them Uganda. And they said, no, we know the scriptures. We know where our borders are, what was our land throughout history. So they were given the land, and on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, declared Israel to be a state again. It happened at 4:30. Actually, it had to happen quick because Shabbat was beginning, and a lot of people, supposed to be a secret meeting. Fortunately, the word got out, and there were lots of people that watched that moment take place.
Let me ask you, many of our listeners may not be familiar with what the word Shabbat means. What would be a word that they might be more familiar with?
The Sabbath.
Sabbath, there you
go. It's the Jewish holy day.
Okay.
Where our holy day as Christians is on Sunday, theirs is on Saturday, which begins at Friday night at sundown and goes to Saturday night at sundown. So the Shabbat started, or the Sabbath, and it started, and as soon as Israel declared itself to be a nation, which was broadcast around the world, I remember people telling me that were alive when that took place. They thought that, wow, this is it. The rapture is going to take place. But what did happen was that Israel was attacked by 5 different nations on 5 sides, beginning in Syria and Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon. All of these nations attacked Israel, the little tiny nation of Israel that really, their generals were the age of 23 years of age. Now, if your generals are 23, and it was a ragtag bunch that had survived, made their way from Europe, either by passage by ship or making their way to the Holy Land or Eretz Yisrael, all right? And they made their way there, and this was the start of the War of Independence that was fought against that little tiny nation of Israel, beginning in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem on the number 1 highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It was being fought all over the state of Israel.
All right, so the group that actually attacked Israel in 1948, after they just become a nation, if you will, again, would they be considered Palestinian or Arab people?
No, they would have been Arabs back then.
Okay.
And really, you know, when you think about it, there's a term that we use a lot. We call people Israelis, all right, or anybody that lived in Israel. But there were Arabs and Jews that lived in this area that was that would be called Israel, and the borders of Israel that were laid out according to the Balfour Declaration and information that was given to that border. But there were Arabs and Jews that coexisted together that lived there. Not every Arab was against the Jews living there, and the Jews were not against the Arabs. I mean, you know, but for 2,000 years, and this land that had basically been a barren. As a matter of fact, Mark Twain, you know, Samuel Clemens, he had made a trip there and he wrote a book about this God-forsaken land. Who would ever want to visit this area? It's God-forsaken. But this was the land that the Jews came back to in 1948.
All right, so let's move ahead a little bit. 1948, Israel regains at least a very small portion of the land that God had promised them. 1967, again, we have a major conflict. It's only 6 days, but it's a huge conflict. Who attacked Israel this time? What group, if you will? And of course, I mean, this is a leading question. What happened in 1967?
So the city of Jerusalem was divided. Part of it, the borders of Jordan came up past the Mount of Olives, all right, past the Kidron Valley, half of this old city, well, maybe 3/4 of the old city. The borderline went into what we call now Jerusalem, the municipality building, if you've ever been there. So Jordan had that. You had Egypt in the south. You had Bashar Hafez al-Assad in the north. You had, General Abu Nasser and Egypt started talking tough about the nation of Israel. You know, he didn't really want to attack Israel, but he started talking tough, and then all of a sudden, his Arab brothers got involved. Jordan, who had tanks on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the old city of Jerusalem, and you know what the Jewish people considered to be the capital of Israel, and the Jews that lived there. Through their departments, the foreign ministry, they said, "Look, Jordan, if you stay out of this, you'll be okay. We won't bother you." But no, Jordan had to decide with Egypt, Abu Nasser, and Syria to attack Israel. And in 1967, the Israelis won that. I'll give you the short version of it. The Israelis won. They reunified the divided capital, or the divided city of Jerusalem. So for a little less than 2,000 years, what had been a divided city now became a unified city. Especially since 1948, it was divided and became unified in 1967. And Israel pushed, when Jordan attacked, Israel pushed Jordan back to the Jordan River. And that's why that term, the West Bank, is used today, because that was the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's a political term. When you say West Bank, it's a political term. And then, of course, Egypt was pushed back and taken all the way through the Sinai, as they were attacked. And that's the next war that we come upon, which would be the Yom Kippur War.
There you go.
And that was a war that took place again with these nations that surround the border of Israel, just the nations that surround the border. On the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when every IDF soldier with a kind-hearted captain, general, and by the way, if you ever meet a kind-hearted captain or general, you need to point him out. But on this Day of Atonement, these men were allowed to go home. So there were very few men that were on duty on Yom Kippur in 1973. I love this picture of the Merkava tank. But as they were attacked, yes, Israel was vulnerable. And at that very moment, they could have been overthrown. But I believe by the hand of God, they were given victory in the Yom Kippur War.
All right, so there's a very common denominator here. We're not talking about the European Union attacking Israel. We're not talking about America attacking Israel or any other country. We're looking at Israel's neighbors that are constantly going after Israel. Is there a common denominator here? Why is this same group, it seems, constantly going after the Jewish people or Israel itself?
Well, you had, there's a train of thought that was taking place. Of course, the Arabs at this point had felt like this was their land. Of course, nobody wanted to do anything with it. When in the Yom Kippur, both in the 67 and then in the Yom Kippur War, Syria was pushed back, and now what was in control of the Golan Heights, Syria had control. Israel pushed them back. Israel pushed Jordan to the Jordan River. And there were a lot of Arabs that lived in the city of Jerusalem that then went to Jordan and left Jerusalem, left the state of Israel. And so you have this mindset that these people want to take back the land. I believe it was a mindset that came out of a mentality of people that were trained by Islamic clerics or teachers. As a matter of fact, basically, as this conflict starts to come, the PLO, established by Yasser Arafat, comes into existence. He was
Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Palestinian Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat, who was kicked out of the country, actually kicked out of Jordan, from Tunisia. He wants to be the leader, and he resurrects a term, or he basically invents a term for the people of Palestine. All right, Palestine is a term that goes back throughout history. Actually, Hadrian was the first to call it the land of Palestine. In fact, in some of our old Bibles, one of the what we would call the land covenant.
Right.
There were Bible teachers, scholars that would call it the Palestinian Covenant. All right, so this term is a political term that Yasser Arafat brought into existence, and he gave it to those people. Now, remember when I said earlier, when Israel became a state, there were Arabs and Jews that lived in that area. So the existence of the Palestinians doesn't go back 3,000 years. All right, we're going to get into where the Palestinians came from and what their name was, but they never had control of the city or the land of Canaan that was promised to the sons of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. Mm-hmm. All right, one was promised one land, and one was promised and given a blessing and went to live somewhere else. And we're going to talk about that. But yes, this conflict that began and the term that was given to the Arabs that lived there were the Palestinian people.
All right, good. So let's come to where we're at today. I want to look at very quickly, because I want to get into the biblical portion of this. Two major things are coming out, and anti-Semitism, or basically those that are against the Jewish people. We're seeing a large movement currently called BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, basically different companies that have Jewish roots, if you will. There's a lot of rhetoric going around, and it's pushed a lot by the Palestinian people to, if it comes from a Jewish nexus, boycott it. Any comments on that at all?
Oh, sure. There are a lot of people that are taking up this battle for the Palestinian people. Recently, I mean, Ben and Jerry's is one that comes to mind.
Huge.
And they have suffered a huge hit from this. But these are people that want to take up the cause of the Palestinians and how Israel is mistreating the Palestinian people. I would beg to differ. I have been to a lot of the camps that were operated by the United Nations, UNIFIL, that were there, these refugee camps. They were kept there just so that these leaders of the Palestinian people could get money. And yes, millions of dollars, billions of dollars have come into, and There were people that took up the cause of the Palestinians and wanted to boycott anything that had to do with Israel.
All right, so again, we have this constant conflict. I want to go to one other one, which has been very prominent, if you will, in the news recently. So most folks are now familiar that Prime Minister Bennett, Naftali Bennett, has taken the place of Benjamin Netanyahu. And here's a statement that was recently made by the Jewish press. Prime Minister Bennett was surprised by United States pressure on settlements, which I want you to describe very quickly.
Yep.
President Biden to reopen Jerusalem's Palestinian consulate. But one of the things, just very quickly, when we're talking about Jewish settlements, what does that mean, and why is that a huge conflict?
Yeah, well, when when Jews were making Aliyah, returning to the land, they needed a place to live, and they believed, just as they did when they didn't take Uganda as their piece of land, they took the borders of what was laid out in God's Word in the Old Testament that they read. So they established that. When people were moving back, they were spreading out, and they wanted to take this land of the borders that are given to them in the Old Testament, 35 different passages pertaining to those borders. And so they would move into areas that were rightfully theirs. They were the first to live there, and it's an area that we, again, that term, the West Bank comes up. That's a political term. We know it better as Judea and Samaria. And these people are called settlers because they would move in there. Can you imagine taking your family and going to the ancient site of Bethel or Tekoa or any of these sites, Shiloh, moving to those sites with your family to live, and every night you had to make sure that the guards were on duty, that you were surrounded, because you were surrounded by people that did not want you there. And so that's why this is so, and the Arabs, there were some that wanted to coexist. There are areas. Kiryat Yarim is an area where Arabs and Jews coexist and have coexisted for a long time. But there's a thought process, and I believe it's a satanic thought process of people trying to wipe out the Jews, and even as they're trying to retake and relive and redevelop some of the ancient cities of the Bible.
All right, so let's now get into the biblical issue. We've looked at the conflicts, past, present, and there's going to be many in the future, which we're aware of. So why don't you take us to the scriptures, explain why this constant conflict has existed, and quite frankly, for thousands of years.
Sure.
Let's go to that.
As we go, this is a conflict that began all the way back with Jacob and Esau, the sons of Isaac. And remember in Genesis chapter 25, Rachel is told that, not Rachel, help me. Who was the mother? Rebecca.
Oh, here we go.
Sorry,
okay.
It was an R. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
A little brain slip right there. But as she is told that she has two twin boys that are in her, two nations are developed within her. That was Jacob and Esau. And of course, we know that story, Genesis chapter 25. As they were born, Jacob steals a birthright, or Esau actually sold his birthright to Jacob, and he connived it and got the blessing from Isaac, who then allowed him to become the son of promise and to become the leader of that family. Jacob and Esau decided, and then go to Genesis chapter 27, they couldn't live together. So Esau wanted a blessing, and he comes to his father, I want a blessing. Give me a blessing. So there's a blessing that's given, but they couldn't live together. And Esau made a promise that he did not keep and would not be kept throughout history, which he said, I will not try to kill my brother. And that was made in Genesis chapter 27. Well, Esau leaves, and now we start to look at the descendants. Esau leaves because he couldn't live with his land and his servants and his family and his cattle in that area. So you have Jacob living in the area, the promised land in Canaan, and Esau goes to Edom, to Mount Seir region. And that's in modern day Jordan today. But back then, when Esau left and went to Edom, to the Edomite, to the mountains of Edom, Esau became Edom. and that's where he raised his family. They lived in what is the area of modern-day Petra. When Esau and his descendants that were there were kicked out of Petra by the Nabateans, the Edomites went to southern Israel to the Negev, where they became the Idumeans.
All right, well, let me, just so for some of our listeners, they may not be familiar with the map, maybe you can use our screen real quick. Just point out, you went through a bunch of different areas there. Kind of go through where Jordan is, where Jerusalem is, where the Nabateans, or if you will, the Edomites, Ammonites, and so forth.
Yeah, well, so we'll use the Dead Sea, the center of this map.
Right here.
Yes,
okay.
as the focal point. And of course, you see the star on the left, that's Jerusalem, and the star on the right of the Dead Sea would be Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. Jordan became a state just shortly before Israel became a state. It was called Transjordan, actually, before that. But the Hashemite kingdom, King Abdullah came to be the king of Jordan, and that was given to them, and that's where the Jordanian people, and actually the people that claimed Jerusalem or part of Jerusalem, or that area, what we call the West Bank today, or they call it the West Bank, that's where they lived. Petra would be at the bottom.
Somewhere in this area.
Yeah, Al-Karak, when you get down in that area, Al-Safari, when you get to that area, that's the area of where modern day Petra was. So Esau left the area where they were, where Jacob and Esau were trying to coexist together, which would have been in the region for sakes of just Jerusalem. And Esau went down to the mountains of Edom and the Mount Seir region.
All right. So now we're getting this rift, if you will. We've got one group of people here, one group of people here. And why, from a biblical perspective then, why has this conflict, which started way back several thousands of years ago, why do we still have this going on today in the 21st century?
Well, actually, Esau was told that he was going to serve his brother Jacob. And throughout the history, and again, Esau did not fulfill his promise that he made to his father of not pursuing Jacob. And it was shortly after that Esau was one that, as a matter of fact, when we look at God's sovereignty, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And it wasn't that he hated, but he's going to hate the fact that this conflict is going to go through the ages. And we do see that through the ages as we look at Scripture. We can go through the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, as they come into existence. We look at Amalek. Was one of those descendants that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 36. And the descendants of Esau, as he is given, he comes on the scene. Well, we see Amalek is really tried a sneaky attack against the Jewish people, or the descendants of Jacob, the Jews. He attacked. God said, all right, these descendants of Amalek are going to be a thorn, and they're going to be at enmity again with the Jewish people. And we see that. As a matter of fact, the Amalekites bothered the Jews as they came out of Egypt. They were there. You mentioned that. Remember that story, Moses, Aaron and Hur, as the Jews battled the Amalekites. It was Aaron and Hur that raised and kept Moses' arms raised in the air, right? And when his arms were raised, they were defeating the Amalekites. So the Amalekites are descendants of Edom, who Edom was Esau. Okay, so we're going to trace that forward. An Amalekite, a descendant of the Amalekites, was Agag. Remember Agag? He was the king of the Amalekites. Samuel told Saul to wipe out the Amalekites.
I believe that was 1 Samuel 15. He goes through a complete scenario.
He was supposed to wipe out. Finally, Samuel says, to Saul, wipe out all the way. So when Saul comes back to Samuel to report that he wiped out the Amalekites and their king, all of a sudden, the scriptures tell us that there was a all right, that's my imitation of a sheep.
There you go.
But Saul didn't kill their sheep because he said, in his words, he wanted to bring them back and offer them as a sacrifice. But really saw the fatness of them and how good they were. And he let King Agag live. So Agag, of course, Samuel took over from Saul. Basically, Saul became non-effective after that. All right. And it was Samuel that took care and wiped out. But the descendants of the Agagites, or those of Agag, became, you look at Esther, all right, Haman. Esther chapter 3, Haman was a descendant of the Agagites, and he was an Agagite that his role was to wipe out the Jewish people. So now we're starting to see through history. Of course, we mentioned Herod the Great. He was an Idumean. He came from the descendants. His mother was an Idumean, so he calls himself the king of the Jews, Herod the Great, the Idumean, Herod the Idumean. Idumean, by the way, is a different pronunciation, a Greek form of Edomite. And then we go through history and we look at the descendants of the Esau, of Edom. Today, as you go through history, we could trace it all the way through, even when you look at the Bosnians and during World War II with Adolf Hitler. We go through to today with the descendants of Edom being the Palestinians.
All right, so I'm going to draw your attention to our chart up here. So basically, you've described this very well without even looking at notes, so I appreciate that. But what we're looking at, we go all the way back to Esau, who's kind of the foundational person, Jacob and Esau, and we go through all of these individuals, and you mentioned several of them, up till we get to somebody that most folks are going to be aware of, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas. These are individuals that, if indeed, and with all due respect to these people, if indeed the Amalekites would have been wiped out when God commanded it, and Agag and somehow a descendant of Agag had to be alive, because now we still have this genealogical chart taking us all the way up to the present, and that conflict still exists. So, Jimmy, we've got about 1 minute left. When will this conflict end?
Oh, this conflict, sorry about that, is going to end at the end of the tribulation period. There's a prophecy, the little book of Obadiah gives us the exact point. And the Edomites, the descendants of Edomites, the Palestinians today will be wiped out as if they never were. That's the little book of Obadiah. That's Ezekiel chapter 36. Chapter 35. And that's the prophecy that the Palestinians will be wiped out as if they never were.
All right, so folks, what are we saying here? Bible prophecy is being fulfilled exactly as stated. The conflict that existed, it is definitely not going away until Jesus Christ comes back. Well, let me just remind you very quickly, what is truth? Jesus Christ said that He is the way, the truth, and the life. Folks, I beg you to make sure, if you've not trusted Christ, to do so quickly. Well, thanks again for watching us on Prophecy Focus.